Hello, I'm Tyrell Williams from the Young People's Law Service, also known as the YPLS. We aim to get young people educated about the law, advise young people on their legal rights, and help the youth in as many ways as possible, including inspiring and informing them. I'm joined by the accomplished barrister Courtenay Griffiths QC, and in this video we discuss his journey in which he offers advice to young people, as well as discussing some reputable cases he has been involved with. So Courtney, from Kingston, Jamaica to 25 Bedford Road Chambers, just exactly how did that happen? What a journey.
Well, I come from a very large family, right? There are 9 of us, 8 boys and 1 girl, and I'm the second youngest. And we were born in one of the roughest parts of West Kingston, an area called Whitfield Town. And we lived at 66 3/4 Chisholm Avenue. And all of my old elder siblings went to Jonestown Primary School and Trenchtown Senior School. And back then in the 1950s, things were rough already in Trenchtown before the gun violence of the 1970s. And so that's where we come from. And my father was a carpenter.
Okay.
And we came in on a boat in October 1961.
What was going through your mind as a young boy, leaving everything behind in Jamaica and coming over to England? What was you're leaving all your friends. What was you thinking at that time?
Well, sure, at one level, I was only 5 when I left. And so at one level, it was something of an adventure because none of us had ever traveled out of the country before. My father had left Jamaica on a number of occasions to work abroad. During the Second World War, he worked on the Panama Canal, widening it so that US warships could travel from the Pacific into the Atlantic. And he had gone to the United States and done farm work. And he actually left Jamaica to emigrate to the United Kingdom when I was 10 weeks old. And then in 1961, he sent for all of us. So we traveled on this boat around the Caribbean, picking up migrants, then eventually sailing across the Atlantic, through the Straits of Gibraltar, to Genoa in northern Italy, because it was an Italian steamship. We were then put on a sealed train, so we couldn't get off, for 3 days, from Genoa, across northern Italy, across France, to Calais, where they then put us on a ferry to Dover, and from Dover to Charing Cross on the boat train, where I met my father for the first time to recognise him.
Okay. And then you ended up in Coventry.
Ended up in Coventry, past my 11 plus. I was the only child of African Caribbean origin in the whole school. There was one other Asian boy, right, Ramesh Sharma. He lives in Vancouver now, he's a doctor.
Are you still in contact with him?
I'm still in contact with him on LinkedIn.
How was it like being the only?
Well, interestingly, in the first term that I was at Badlake, and we're talking about 1968 now, there was a lot of racism directed at me by a lot of the boys. And so what I arranged to do, because none of my elder siblings went to that school, so one day, all of my 7 brothers turned up at the school gate. And interestingly, I never had a problem again after that. And so thereafter, I must say, I had a wonderful time at Badlake School. And from there, I went on to the London School of Economics, which is just around the corner from here, 25 Bedford Road. So I spent all my student and working life, some almost 40 years, within like a 2-mile radius of here.
Okay. And you were called to the bar in 1980.
Yeah.
And before that, you underwent a pupillage.
Mm-hmm.
That's something compulsory, I understand, for all law students.
Because, Tyrell, how are you qualified to become a lawyer? There are a couple of ways you can do that. Route number 1 is to leave from school having got very good A-level grades and study law at university. Okay? Then once you've finished, you do the professional examination, which differs whether you want to become a solicitor or a barrister. And thereafter, if you want to become a barrister, you do a 12-month period of what's called pupillage. It's really an apprenticeship, where for the first 6 months you follow a practicing barrister around, and then for the second 6 months they set you loose on an unsuspecting world. All right? So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is this, and there's much to recommend this, and that is to leave school and do a completely, any degree you want at university. Then you do a 1-year conversion course or law course, and that puts you in the same position as someone who has spent 3 years doing a law degree. Now the benefits of going that route is this. Because the two most popular subjects at university are law and medicine, to get into a good university to do those subjects, you're probably going to be asked for 4 A stars at A-level, all right? And it's important, in particular if you want to come into come to the bar, to go to a top university. And I'll explain why. Because 40% of all the people who enter the barrister side of the profession go to 4 law schools: Oxford, Cambridge, University College London, and the London School of Economics where I went. 40%, okay? And so, whereas to get into one of those top universities to study sociology, politics, or something like that, the grades demanded are much less, okay? Yeah. And you come out having done the conversion course with the kudos of a degree from one of these top universities, okay? So by using your head, it's possible to get ahead in this still very elitist society. All right? And so I'd commend that to people. Don't think to become a lawyer you need to have a law degree. In many ways, I think it's a mistake to do a law degree. I'll be quite frank with you. To my mind, one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was studying law at university. Knowing what I know now, I would have studied something completely different and then done the conversion course.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting to it, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. And the reason why I'm passionate about it is this: that I think many young black people coming out of the inner cities are doing themselves a disservice by not understanding how the system works and how they can use the system to their advantage.
How would they be able to understand how the system works? Because most young people are now following mainstream media, and they're spreading, they're spreading propaganda and telling you this is the way to make it when really it's not. So how can we going forward open the eyes of these young black people then and let them know these are the ways to get to a certain position?
No, I appreciate that young black people, and not just in the United Kingdom, globally, are fed a certain diet that for them to achieve success, it has to be in music, sport, or something like that. All right? You and I know that. Yeah. But it's for us, I think, we have the responsibility to change that mindset. So, for example, I am chair of a mentoring charity in the borough of Lewisham in southeast London, where I live. And I go around schools and speak to GCSE students and A-level students and explain this to them, that you can get into Oxford or Cambridge or one of these top universities if you use your head, apply there to do the right subject. And if you want to become like me, a barrister at the end of the day, you do the 1-year conversion course and you're in the same position as I was when I left LSE back in the 1980s with a law degree. But people need to appreciate that the downside of doing it that way is, remember, you've got another year's fees. Because to do that 1-year conversion course, is going to cost you somewhere in the region of £15,000 to £17,000. So that's the downside.
Is that part of an agenda to make it so pricey so that unaffordable for people in the city?
Well, increasingly, the bottom line is that the bar is returning to the elitist profession it was up until the mid-60s when legal aid was introduced by the government. Up until then, the bar was the preserve of the rich and the wealthy. Those who could afford, during those early years as you're building up a profession, those who could afford to do that, i.e. no money coming in, but still having to be working hard to build up that reputation. And the bar is going back to that now. One of the important lessons which is transmitted to the rich and the powerful through their education is confidence. You go to somewhere like Eton or Winchester, one of these top public schools, you're told you're going to be running the country when you leave here. All right? David Cameron, can you imagine when David was like 15? Right? You're going to be running the country, or you'll be running the city, or you'll be running a major corporation. That gives you confidence. How many comprehensive kids in the inner city are told, as a matter of course, that they can aim as high as that? How many of them? And you see, when I was in school, because it was the best school in the city, that's the lesson that was being taught to these boys. But the problem was, they couldn't say to the other 24 white boys in the class, you're all going to be running the country tomorrow, but not you, Griffiths. All right? They couldn't say that. And also, being the only black kid in the school from aged 11 until 18 and a half, competing with them on a daily basis, I knew I was good as, if not better, than the vast majority of them. And so I left with that confidence.
Yeah.
That pride in yourself, which allows you to be yourself without having to put on an accent because you think that's the way to achieve. I've never ever done that. Never ever done that and never would. And in fact, when we were at it, I still dropped on another patois, all right? Because I'm never going to forget that part of myself.
Yeah.
Because that's what has made me who I am today and given me an advantage which many of my white peers don't have.
Absolutely. Why did you choose criminal law?
In part it was because of my experience as a young black man growing up in the United Kingdom. And at a time when police officers would routinely call you blackie or wog on the streets, and didn't see anything wrong with it. Remember, I grew up in a Coventry where a Conservative MP in a neighbouring town in the West Midlands campaigned during a general election on the slogan, if you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour. That's the Britain I grew up in the 1960s. You couldn't go to Oxford Street, a lot of black kids back then, without being stopped. And I also recall that because we were the biggest black family in Coventry at the time, because when we arrived in Coventry in 1961, imagine, we were coming from a tropical climate, so we had no winter clothes and we'd arrived in October. And so imagine the picture of my mum and dad leading these 9 kids, ranging from like 15 down to 5, around Coventry city centre to kit us out with winter clothing. And literally white people would come up to my parents and say, can we touch them? Because it was supposedly good luck.
Wow.
And we're supposed to be the superstitious ones, us black people. So that's the experience I came out of. And also, I like jury advocacy, and I think that's my main strength.
What about it appeals to you in particular?
It's the fact that these 12 people, your fellow citizens, who you've never seen before, you share the experience of a trial with them, and then you have to address them at the end of the day on behalf of your client, and you only have that one opportunity, okay? And then you have to deal with the anxiety of them retiring, and you not knowing, 1, when they're going to come back with a verdict, 2, what that verdict's going to be. And it's being able to build up a relationship of trust with these 12 individuals during the trial process, which I find so attractive and endearing. And it still excites me after 35 years doing the job.
Okay, I'm going to move on now. You've, in your career, covered many high-profile cases, some of which involved young people and occurred in London. I'm going to take you back to the 6th of October, 1985. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's utter chaos. Cars are being burnt. Police and young black people are going at each other's throats. What was going through your mind initially?
Well, the interesting thing is, at the time that the Broadwater Farm blew up, I wasn't actually at the bar, because having completed pupillage, I went to work at the Labour GLC in the early 1980s, during the Thatcher years. And I was working on the Police Committee Support Unit, as it was called, at County Hall. And so I understood that there was a very real tension between the police and the black community, which had been building up through the 60s, the 70s. And what happened in Tottenham, because a policeman died, it's been given a certain significance. But in many ways, Tottenham and what happened on the Broadwater Farm was not on the same scale or level of violence as what had happened in Liverpool prior to that. In Liverpool, the police almost lost control of the city centre. They came within inches of losing control of the centre of the whole of Liverpool. Whereas up in Tottenham, what happened was contained within that council estate. And there was a great deal of anger there, because you remember, Mrs. Jarrett had died, and within hours, because of what had been happening on the estate with stop and search, swamp policing tactics, it was a tinderbox waiting to blow up.
Before that, there was a lot of tension between the police and these black people, but specifically these young black people. Do you think that because it was young black people, it made any difference to, were they easier targets for the police in that sense?
I will answer your question in this way. At one level, Broadwater Farm, within my experience, was unique in that there was a blend of both middle-aged people and young people who were involved in the riot. For the most part, those who killed PC Keith Blakelock weren't kids. They were grown men who lived on that estate. And people who live on the estate know who they are, okay? But at the same time, the pressure point was the particular relationship between young black people and the police. That's the pressure point. Can you imagine that wave of people who came over in the 50s and 60s and had kids then, right? Those kids would have gone through schooling here with the expectations of going on to get a job, with the expectation of being accepted as being British and being able to live like any other English person. And then imagine being failed in the schools, so you come out with qualifications less than your intellect deserves. You can't get a job and you're constantly being harassed by the police. Can you imagine the kind of tensions, the kind of emotions that would generate in that generation? And that's what exploded at that time. It's that young black cohort who were just entering or just beyond adulthood who were at the forefront of that battle with the police. Because of the reasons I've just given in terms of education.
So you're saying it's a build-up of anger?
It's a build-up of anger.
Surely there's better alternatives than to riot if you want to get your point across?
People just don't get up one day and say, I'm going to burn down the area I live in. People are not that stupid. Right? They don't get up and say they're going to destroy by fire their own communities. Something has to be happening to cause someone to go to that extent. Because remember, this happened at a particular historical juncture in British history, where the Labour Party had been turfed out by Thatcher, who had come in with a very conservative agenda, an agenda being copied across the Atlantic by Reagan in the United States. And that was to rein in the trade unions, get rid of the excess in terms of employment in particular nationalized industries like the coal mine. And it resulted in a high rise in unemployment. Now, who do you think was the first who was going to get fired?
But in terms of voicing opinions, I mean, we've recently, in America, there's been some shootings of black men, and the Americans have marched. They've taken the more peaceful approach. Some of them have, engaged in inappropriate behaviour, as it would be deemed. Does it have to be a riot for our point to be heard?
No, it doesn't have to be a riot. The question is, can you dictate or predict the route or the channel a people's anger is going to take? No, you can't. You can't do that. That cannot be controlled and it cannot be predicted. And I am not so sure that one is talking about necessarily a contradiction between violent protests and peaceful protests. Sometimes the two have to go hand in hand. Sometimes you need a Martin Luther King and a Malcolm X. And sometimes you need a Bernie Grant and a riot on the Broadwater Farm.
Okay. You represented Nicky Jacobs,
yeah,
who has just been acquitted. I believe it was last year. He got acquitted of murder. When young people see that this has happened, this man has been deemed guilty and has lived out a guilty sentence in jail for something that he hasn't done, can young people trust in the law when they see that incorrect convictions are occurring?
Well, miscarriages of justice are nothing new to the criminal justice system here in the United Kingdom. They've always occurred. They occurred but they always seem to occur in relation to groups from certain parts of society. That's with Nicky Jacobs, because look, Nicky Jacobs had been arrested following the first riot in 1985. He was tried in 1986 for riot, was given an 8-year prison sentence at the Old Bailey, one of the longest sentences short of life imprisonment anyone received during the course of that riot. And he was only an adolescent at the time. And the rap poem, which formed such a major part of the prosecution against him 28 years later, that was available to the police from way back then, yet they chose not to charge him with murder. Then this guy was kept in custody for over a year, awaiting trial for something for which he was eventually acquitted. Now, to my mind, although the jury reached the right verdict, that too was a miscarriage of justice, because he shouldn't have been charged with a murder in the first place. But the police felt themselves under pressure because the Metropolitan Police in particular have never recovered from the experience of Broadwater Farm, the killing of PC Blakelock. Even the riot training the police undergo now is based upon the scenario which developed on Broadwater Farm that night, because it created so many cleavages within the Metropolitan Police. The lower ranks who were at the Police Federation members, who were taking the brunt of the beating on the night, blamed the higher echelons of the Metropolitan Police. And there was open warfare between the lower ranks and the commissioner and the higher officers for several years after Broadwater Farm, because each was blaming the other. And the tactics adopted by the higher echelons had resulted in the death of Blakelock. That whole experience has been seared on their minds.
I want to fast forward a few years to the year 2000. I'm going to put you in South London, in a Peckham estate. A young 10-year-old boy is found bleeding profusely on a staircase, is later taken to King's College and is pronounced dead. That boy's name is Damilola Taylor. What was your initial thoughts when you first heard the situation, the case? Like, what was you think?
Well, there's a part of me which is still unsure as to precisely what happened to Damilola Taylor, because he had no property to rob, apart from the coat he was wearing, which wasn't particularly expensive, okay? Maybe it was a case of bullying, I don't know. But I'm still troubled by that case.
Why do you think it received so much attention from the media?
Because of one, where it took place, and so it confirmed people's stereotypes about Peckham and the black community who lived there and what they're like. They're just savages. They even kill their own kids. All right? It also fitted into that whole imagery at the time about marauding, feral groups of black kids, mugging, and making our streets unsafe. So it fed into all of that. And also there was the innocence of Damilola Taylor himself, given his age. All right?
You spoke about, you just said that the area, Peckham, it had a reputation. Surely if it had a reputation, it should have been better policed. Why did it take such a tragic incident for policing around the area to be improved?
Charlie, I think you got to understand, it's not that communities like Peckham aren't policed. In fact, they're over-policed. Right, because through the use of stop and search and so on. But that over-policing does not make those areas safer. Because the bottom line is, the police are in the main in those areas to control, not to assist. And so there's always been this contradiction, that despite that massive police presence, black people don't feel that the police are particularly concerned about their own welfare. And the problem why that occurs is because in many ways, black communities like Peckham at the time do not own the police. And by ownership I mean being engaged with the police in such a way that the police take our concerns and our interests seriously. That's the important factor which is missing in many of these communities. And that's why communities like Peckham are declared to be so lawless.
Okay. So you were the defence barrister of one of the people charged initially in the case. Your client walked away, as did the other three people, and later two completely separate juveniles were convicted.
The first trial, there were 6 defendants initially, all young adolescents. All right? And I was the first on the indictment, which meant that I carried the brunt of the challenge to the police case. All right? And we were able to secure an acquittal in that first trial. And the interesting thing was that I was, along with the judge, heavily criticized by the media because they claimed that we had bullied this young female witness, which is why these killers had been acquitted. Amongst those who vilified me at the time was now Archbishop Sentamu, the Bishop of York. He did a report in which he criticized me personally for the way in which I conducted myself in the trial. And as things transpired, those initial 6 kids were innocent. And again, the police hadn't done their job properly. Because later, when they did revisit the investigation, they found DNA evidence which directly linked 2 other boys never charged with the killing, and eventually they were convicted, which means that the initial conviction would have been a miscarriage of justice. And yet, Archbishop Santana has never had the good grace to apologize.
There's a recurring theme of this miscarriage of justice. So young white males, do you think they suffer a miscarriage of justice?
Well, if you go to the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on any particular day, there are 18 courts there. And I promise you will find that at least 10 of those courts will involve trials involving black males, young black males. Now, in all the years I've spent at the Old Bailey, I couldn't say that about young working class white males. I couldn't say that. So one of the questions we have to ask is, why the difference?
When you're involved in the wrong side of the law as a young person, it can really hinder your future. Do you think that's fair?
Well, it's not a question of it being fair or unfair, it's a fact of life. Imagine the anxiety of being on remand at Belmarsh for a year and a half, not knowing whether you're going to be wrongly convicted of a murder and then made subject to a life sentence. Imagine the anxiety and the pressure that causes. That is bound to have a lasting psychological effect. So it's not just a question of it being a miscarriage of justice. Physically, it has an impact upon it. Physically, you could see the impact of it on Nicky Jacobs, which is why he broke down in tears in the dock when he was acquitted.
I'm going to move on again, finally, to the final case that I want to talk about. Killing of Mark Duggan effectively led to the 2011 riots. And it's interesting how it spread, because it was BlackBerry Messenger, like social media. How difficult is it now getting to police? How difficult is it to police areas because of social media?
Well, in fact, it's made it easier for the police.
Why do you say?
Because nowadays, we're dealing with what I call automated justice. By that I mean this. When I started out 34 years ago, the evidence in most criminal trials were alleged confessions made by the defendants, called verbals, all right, and eyewitness evidence, all right. Nowadays, as in the trial I'm currently doing at the Old Bailey, most of the evidence now is either CCTV, telephone evidence, social media, okay? So why do you need eyewitnesses?
Yeah.
You know, why do you need to go through that trouble?
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's why I call it automated justice. Because automatically now we're being policed in a completely different way than 35 years ago when I started out.
I want to talk about gang violence, because that's the word being thrown around, that whole Mark Duggan was a gangster. Is enough being done to tackle gang violence?
I think we need to be careful. Gang-related violence is a problem in certain communities. I've been involved in those cases, so I know the reality of it. But sometimes we overplay the significance of that. Sometimes we attach too much importance to that, with the idea of young kids being lured into lives of crime as young as 11, being asked to carry guns around and so on. A lot of that is just pure folklore. But at the same time, I do think we need to be alert to what is going on in our communities. And I don't think it's good enough for us as black people to see that solely as a policing problem. It's not. It's our problem. And it will only be resolved when we as black parents, we as black brothers and sisters, get our hands dirty and get to grips with certain things which are happening in our community, which we can control. And this is one of them.
Could you see any similarities between the 2011 riots and the Broadwater Farm?
Not really. One, because I don't think those who engaged in the 2011 riots were as politically aware as those who engaged in the riots in the early 1980s. I don't think they were. Hence the concentration on looting during that riot. It was completely different social and political mentality to that which obtained in the early 1980s.
So from Broadwater Farm to 2011, have you seen any improvements in regards to law and young people?
I think the Metropolitan Police have made massive strides since 1985. They're not perfect, but I think the police have made a greater effort to change than any other major institution in British society during that period. And they got a further wake-up call with Stephen Lawrence. So I'm not suggesting things are perfect, but interestingly, right, Tyrell, as the evidence-gathering, evidence-giving thing has changed from when I started, I've noticed a change in policemen. Because when I entered the job, I'll be quite blunt with you and put it in a language which we could all understand. My experience as a young black kid growing up in the United Kingdom meant that my attitude was, all coppers are bastards. I do not believe that now. I think, for the most part, police officers do a very difficult job, and they do it well. And I don't think that police officers as individuals go out on the street with the intention of acting out any kind of racist stereotype. But I still think that as an institution, a lot still has to be done in order to change those stop and search figures which show that young black men and young Asian Muslim men now are more likely to be stopped and searched than anybody else, 4 or 5 times more likely. So as an institution they have to change, and they still have a long way to go. But I certainly don't believe nowadays that all coppers are bastards.
Okay. Look, Courtenay, I just want to, that will conclude our talk. I want to say thank you. You're a really busy person and you've taken time out to speak with me and support us young people, and that's really encouraging and admirable, and I want to thank you for that.
My pleasure, Tyrell.
Right.
All right.
Brilliant.
That's the wrap then, Jay.
Yeah, definitely.
Now what I'm going to do, Courtenay, is I'm just going to ask you a set of questions. I'm going to ask you favourite, followed by a topic, and you just throw out the answer. I've got about 6 there.
Okay.
Just be interested to see. So I'll start off with favourite musician,
Burning Spear.
favourite song,
Guilty.
favourite Guilty by
Burning Spear.
Okay. Favourite holiday destination,
South Africa.
favourite car,
BMW.
which one? Anyone in particular?
None in particular, anyone.
Okay. Favourite sport,
Football.
Favourite
Of course.
Favourite football team?
Look, there's only one proper team who play in red.
That's Arsenal.
That's Liverpool.
Oh, yeah.